In our last video, we talked about how we could take multiple textures on objects and turn them into one texture and one material for different objects. And we started to talk about how the same thing and techniques could be done for doing lighting. Now, in this particular scene that I'm in Hubs, I talked about last time, all of the lighting here is actually part of the textures themselves. The illusion is quite strong here, mostly because the way that the lighting was baked onto the surfaces is very, very smooth. So you're even seeing things like bounced lighting coming from the sky, a little bit of blue up here. We're seeing, um, in some cases, a little bounced light coming off the leaves of this tree, and so the purple spills onto the walls a bit. But all of this is done mostly to make the scene very, very inexpensive for your computer to render. If you look over here at an object, we still have a light within our scene for hubs, mostly just for things like objects and avatars so that they don't look completely dark. Another thing that hubs does is take the sky background, we call it the sky dome or skybox, and uses whatever the colors are there to create a bit of a reflection cube, which is a sort of a fake way of doing reflections on shiny objects. So in the case of this mug, it actually has some shininess to it, and that's what's giving it a little bit of its lightness. Um, so that's not going to look the same for all objects, and uh, if we bring in something like a Google Poly model or something that is using very, very plain materials, you're not really going to see the effect of the lighting much at all in here. Anyway, what I'd like to do now is show you how you can use Blender to bake in lighting onto your objects. And this should create quite a bit of savings for your scenes, especially if they're larger. So let's go take a look over in Blender. So I've opened up Blender and I've decided to keep working on the scene that I was using before. By using an earlier tutorial, this will help you understand if you need to go back and look at part 1 and part 2, just so you can see how we got to this point. Now, what we have here is just a quick recap. The object with 3 different textures on it that have now been combined into one, that you can see down in my atlas here. And you can see that it is also one material. It's still called Part A. And it has one UV map handling the whole thing. So if I go into the UV editing mode, and I am in edit mode as well, you can see all the parts laid out in one sheet. This is actually going to be really handy for doing the lighting. Now, somebody asked me after they saw the tutorial, why did I waste all of this space when really each side of these, like the large cube, for example, uses the same exact texture. I could have used one piece on a sheet and had a much larger piece. And they're absolutely correct. It would be more efficient to have it all in one. Except now, by doing it the way that I did, this is actually going to work out quite well for the lighting scenario that I want to do. Because if you bake lighting into the object, and let's say I place a light out in my Blender scene, every single part of this object is going to have the light affect it differently. And therefore, each piece of the UV map needs to be separate. If as soon as pieces start overlapping, the lighting is not going to look correct on them. So I didn't really talk about that in the last tutorial, but now you understand maybe why I did that. So in order to do this, I'm going to go back over to the shading mode and start adding some lights to my scene and see if we can get those lights baked into the textures themselves. So what I'll do first is make sure I'm back in object mode and I don't really need anything selected. So one thing I want to talk about first is how Blender does its lighting on objects. Now, when you're looking at things in the viewport, quite often you're either looking at it in a shadeless mode like this, or you're looking at it with textures on. And in the case of seeing the textures, it's really important that the whole scene not look completely dark. And even though I don't have any lights in this scene, Blender allows you to see things a little better by adding their own version of a sky dome in the background. And usually you don't really notice it very much, especially if you first switch to the textured mode and you'll notice that inside here is this little ball that looks like made of chrome or something. By switching to these different types in here, now yours might look different from mine. I have different ones loaded. You can try out different backgrounds, and those backgrounds really affect the lighting on your object, at least in the viewport. Some of these are made to be interiors, some of them are exteriors, and in all cases, whichever one you select, you can go to this rotation slider underneath and move it around. Now, as you spin it, you'll see the one in the viewport at the bottom there spinning around. You're actually moving that image around your object and sort of changing the different colors on it based on the image. The brighter parts of the image look more like, the light's coming from that direction. Here's one of a kind of a grassy field, and you can see there's definitely one spot that is brighter than others. Now it's behind my object, so the side looks dark, and I turn around and you see it. Those are not going to get baked into your object unless you explicitly add them as part of your scene. So right now they're only used for viewing, and I want to show you how you can set those up to be a part of the actual baked lighting scenario. So if you're in shading mode and you're looking at a material, say like the one on this object, this is actually not quite the place to do it. You'll notice at the top of the material window, there is a little drop down that says Object. And if you expand that and go down to World, now you can actually see what it's using for the background. Now, right now, it's just using this plain background node, and it has a gray color, and there's not much to it. In fact, if you go back to the shadeless mode, it's really kind of using like a plain background for this. If you actually want to use a skybox or what's called image-based lighting on your object, what you need to do is add a texture node that's called, not image texture, that's what a lot of people think it is. It's actually environment texture. And this environment texture node specifically knows to look for equirectangular images, which is a fancy way of saying like a 360 wraparound image. Now, you may not have any of these handy, but there are a bunch of websites where you can grab these for free. There are ones you can pay for. I actually happen to have a bunch that came with Substance Painter that I can use temporarily, and I actually have them up here in this window. So what I like to do is look for one that I think will work for this. There's many different kinds. There's interiors and exteriors. I like some of these studio ones that are just kind of plain grayscale lighting effects. This Tomoko Studio one I like a lot. I think I can just drag this and drop it in to here. Oh, that works like that. I can just drag it in and it automatically creates, well, it actually made the wrong kind. It's not really what I want. I want to go back and add that environment texture node again. And then I don't know how you actually just drag and drop one in here. I might just hit open and then browse for it. Go find it. And now what I can do, once I've chosen that wraparound picture, this equirectangular 360 image, is just simply connect the color to the color of the background. And now it's going to use that instead of whatever I have in here. Now, in order to switch to it, I actually have to turn on Scene World under this dropdown. Look at that. It actually renders it in the background. And that's kind of nice to be able to see which direction it's going. Now, the only thing about doing it this way is I can no longer just use this menu to rotate it around. You can see it's not showing the old one anymore. So in order to do that, I need to add a couple of nodes within the world section of the material editor to spin this thing around. Now I have a couple saved in my quick favorites. One of the ones you'll use is the one called texture coordinate. And the other one that you're going to look for is the one called mapping. And what I usually do is I just plug in the generated texture coordinate into this first slot here, and then the vector into vector, And now what I'm able to do is play around with the rotation values here to actually watch it rotate in the viewport. So let's say I didn't want the light coming from mostly over there. As I spin this Z value, it's going to twirl it around on the Z axis. And you'll actually see the lighting change on the object as I do it. This is a really nice way to get some basic lighting on your object without having to worry about specific light sources. And it would be very easy at this point to say switch to a different background like this bus garage, and then you can actually see how the color from it affects your object. I'm going to go back to the one I had. I think this one will work pretty well. I'm going to move it around a little bit so that the main light source, that bright white part, is coming from over there. And I want this little cube to kind of be on the dark side. The other thing that you can do if you find that it's just too bright or not bright enough is go to the background node that's already in the world setting and just lower the strength a bit, and you'll actually see the whole thing get lighter or darker. In this case, I'm going for a little more dramatic look, so I'm going to bring this down to about 0.2, just so I have some light on it, but most of it's pretty dark. I want to show you how to do it with other lights. So in order to do this, once I have this set up, I'm going to go and start adding some lights. Now, if you've used Blender, you're probably familiar with how you can add point lights and spotlights and things like that. I'm going to start with a spotlight, just so you can see a very dramatic change on the object. So when I drop in this spotlight, it's going to go to the middle there, and I'm going to move it up. And you might be wondering, well, wait, I can't see it. And what you need to do also inside this viewport shading dropdown is turn on scene lights. So I've turned on scene world already, so I can see the background. I want to turn on scene lights. And there it appears on my object. Now this light happens to be pretty dim, and so I'm going to select it and go to its object data properties. It looks like a little light bulb. And right now it's only a 10-watt bulb, which is a pretty weak light source. I'm going to make it more like 200 watt, just so I get a very dramatic circle on there. And then the other thing I'll play around with maybe is the size of the spot shape. Right now it's a 45-degree angle. I can open that up a bit. I can play with this blend value, which is kind of the soft edge. And maybe I'll just rotate my light a little bit so it's hitting another part of the cylinder here. And just to show you, like, if this was a room you were in, you could easily add a light that way. And once this is baked in, it'll make it very cheap to render the object. I have shadows turned on, so the object is casting shadows on itself. Let's add a couple more lights. Just for a little more dramatic effect, I'm going to add a point light. And then I'm going to slide it over a little bit until I can see it. And just to show you how cool this is, you can actually play around with different colors. Make it a 60-watt bulb. Let's do maybe a bluish color. Maybe not too saturated. Well, actually, I'll make it pretty bright. And this thing is actually also casting shadows right now, which is what's making these lines appear from the shadow of the box. I'll slide it around a little bit, just so it lights up a little bit of this side of the cube. Right, that one looks pretty cool. And then I'm going to add one more light over here on this side, just to show you can use any type of light. This one's an area light. I really like area lights for like soft effects or sometimes light coming through windows and things. So I'll pull this over. And one of the things I like about the area light is you can change its shape to be rectangular instead of square, which means you can narrow this into like a smaller strip of light, almost like an overhead fluorescent light or something like that. And I'll slide it over a little and slide it back so it's near the wall. So you can imagine some kind of like recessed lighting or something on your object. Maybe I'll pull it up a bit so I catch a little bit on the top of this cube. And let's do a cooler color than that. Let's do like or I should say a warmer color. Let's do it like an orange sort of color. And we could even go a little bit brighter, maybe like a 40 watt. Yeah, that looks pretty cool. So, you can imagine doing a street, like I said, a street with street lights shining on it, or lights in a bedroom or a living room or something like that. Now, in order to get these onto the object, let's do the next step. The nice thing is that we've already set up all the UVs on this object, and the textures everything is ready to go to get our lighting ready. So the only thing I really need to do is rebake this with different settings than I had before. So what I'll do is select the object, and I have to make sure that I go back in the shader editor over to object. I was on world before looking at the background. I'm going to switch to object. And I need to do a very similar thing to what I did before where I bake the textures. Now I've lost those nodes because I removed them at the end of the last tutorial. So all I need to do again is just add another image texture like I did before in my favorites. So you don't have them saved in your favorites, you'll need to go into add and find them in here. And you can always search for them. So if you type image texture, it'll show up here. And then you can select it. So the last time I had 2 sets of UV maps for the baking. I don't need that anymore. I already have the UVs laid out the way that I need them to be. So I will just plug in the old UV map into this one just to make sure it's using them. But that's not really completely necessary. What I will do, though, is make a new image texture. I'd like to keep this old one just so I don't mess it up. I'm going to do what I did last time where I make a new image texture, and I'll call this baked lighting. And then I will set the image to be pretty high resolution. I think this is already a 2048 if I remember from the last time. And I don't need any alpha, and it's just going to be a blank black image. That's fine. What it's going to do is transfer all the texture information and lighting information onto a new texture. So if I select it over here, baked lighting, you'll see it's blank and empty. So just like in the last tutorial, the only thing you really have to remember to do is make sure that this node is selected. This is going to be the target for your bake. So then I need to go over to the rendering tab here, and it's called render properties. Make sure that my render engine is set to cycles. I'm rendering on the CPU, not the GPU. Otherwise I won't see the bake settings. And now this time, instead of baking the diffuse for the bake type, I'm going to switch to the one called combined. Now, the nice thing about combined is you have the choice of not only all these different ambient occlusion and all these other things that I talked about, but I can actually bake in the direct and indirect lighting. Direct lighting is the light coming directly out of each light source, and indirect is the bounced lighting that you're going to get. Now, you're not actually even seeing the bounced lighting yet. It's going to look a lot cooler than this. But what I need to do is just make sure that I have all these checkboxes on. Some of them are not necessary because we don't have things like subsurface scattering on our object. And these are other topics we could talk about another time. But for now, I'll just leave them all to the defaults and make sure that it's set to combined, direct, and indirect lighting. And then once again, make sure that my image node is selected because that's what's going to be rendered with all this. So I'm going to hit bake over here and we'll wait for it to happen. Now I've skipped ahead. I'm only about 20% through this render of the texture bake process. And I just wanted to point out that you may wonder, compared to the last time you might have tried this without lighting, that it was a lot faster. And that's because it was only using images and textures to do the bake. This time it's actually calculating a lot more complicated stuff. This baked bounced light can take a lot longer to render because it's having to calculate lots of light rays going from 3 different lights onto the object, including the image-based lighting in the background. So if you find it's pretty slow, don't be surprised. There are lots of things you can do to speed this up, mostly involving changing settings, like your render settings and uh, how complicated things are. But I'm going to leave that for maybe another time, or those are settings you can look up in Blender of how to speed up. But there are plenty of tutorials out there about that. I'm really just giving you the basics for now. Okay, so we're back. After the render, if you have your baked lighting image over here in the 2D view, you'll immediately see that it looks different from how it looked before. What we have now is the same texture layout that we had before, except now we're seeing lighting on many of the surfaces. Now, some of them actually got darker, and that's actually because underneath the object, there's not a lot of light hitting it, including from the background. The background has a pretty dark floor. So maybe if you zoomed in here, you'd see it slightly, but it's pretty dark in those places. But the rest of them got a bit of the blue light, a bit of the white light on top, and a bit of the orange light from the area light on the side. And then the areas that didn't have direct light sources actually got lighting from the background image itself. That's called image-based lighting. And so now we could do exactly what we did in the last tutorial where we save this image. I'm going to go ahead and go to this little 3-line hamburger menu. I don't know what they actually call this menu in Blender, but it's sort of commonly known as a hamburger menu. And I'm going to choose Save As. And then I'm going to save my file as baked lighting, and I can set whatever I want, whatever type. I'm going to use PNG, that's fine. And now I know for sure that I've got this image saved. Now, if you want to see the result on your object, just like before, all we really need to do is switch out the texture that we were using before, which was this texture with no lighting, and swap it with the one that does have lighting. So I can just run this wire from here to here, and there it is. It actually has the lighting on it. Now, it might look a little bit different than it looked in the viewport, and that's because you're actually seeing bounced light, whereas before it was just using direct light, unless I had gone to the actual render view. But this looks really nice and soft. You get all this sort of fine gradient going on in here, as well as along some of these side parts. You can see a nice crisp shadow coming from this point light on the side, and you can even get a little bit of the softness of the edge of that spotlight at the top. And this is really great because now if this object gets loaded into hubs, or any game engine for that matter, you don't have to worry about lighting for it. Everything is all baked in, and we can actually get rid of the baked texture out of here and don't really need this UV map thing anymore. And that's all it needs. Now, the reason it looks as good as it does is because this happens to be using a 2048 by 2048. It's a 2K texture. And that's going to make things pretty sharp. Now, you might not always want to do such a large texture for your objects. You might reserve this for maybe like larger scene type meshes, but for a prop or something, you could probably get away with a lot less. And a lot of that just depends on how close you want to get to the object when you're using it in a game engine or in hubs. And so this, you can imagine doing this for a whole room. You can imagine doing this for even just a few simple props sitting on a shelf or something if you want. But it'll take away a lot of the complexity. And now when you're in hubs, you don't necessarily need lots of light sources or anything, unless you just want to make sure the avatars are lit and go from there. I will say, I mentioned a minute ago before this was done rendering that it was pretty slow, and part of that is because, I'll give you the quickest tip here, is that the render under the sampling menu in the render settings, you have 128 samples that it's doing for each pixel. That's quite a bit for something this simple, but the result is pretty good. Now, when you're testing, one thing you might want to do, and I'll do another one. I don't want to overwrite my texture from before, so I'll plug this back in as if it had no lighting on it. Now it's using the actual lights from the scene. This new texture, you could do it at a lower resolution. That would speed things up. In fact, let's try doing it at like half what it was. Here's a 1024. I'll just call this low res or something. Don't need any alpha. That's transparency. And I'll hit OK. Make sure that that is selected. I'm going to switch over to look at that low res texture, which is black right now. And before I hit bake, what I like to do sometimes for testing is just lower the number of samples way down. Like you could bring this all the way down to like 2 or 4. And you'll see what a difference this makes. I don't even really need to pause the video to watch how fast this is. When I hit bake, there it goes. Super fast. And I can see that it works. Now, don't be surprised how low res this is. When you zoom in, you're going to see a lot of little dots and fireflies, they call them, just because of the inaccuracy of that particular bake. But, you know, you could still test it out, put it on the object, see what it looks like. It's actually not too bad. That's half resolution and way fewer samples on the light bake. So this is a great way to just check to see if you've got everything set up. Now, full disclosure, when I did the render the first time, what you saw in the end was a little bit of editing magic. Mine didn't work. I made a mistake somewhere along the line. I think when I was saving my file or messing around with it between the last tutorial and this, I had accidentally taken my mesh and inverted the faces. So all of the normals, in other words, the vectors that tell the object which way surfaces face, happened to be flipped and they were facing inward. And I didn't know because when you're in render mode like this, there's no option to turn backface culling on. So it wasn't until I went to this plane mode like this, it's just regular old solid shading mode, that I actually saw, I'll flip them for you here, my normals were flipped inside out, and I didn't know until I turned on backface culling, and then I realized why the lights wouldn't bake onto the surfaces. And it's because the cycles renderer ignores culling like this, and it just said, oh, I guess none of these surfaces are getting hit with light because the lights are all on the outside, and the object itself was blocking the light. So just want to show you that. It's something that, you know, every beginner has done as a mistake. I'm not a huge beginner, but I made the mistake too. And so when I went back to this mode, everything looked fine, but I couldn't figure out why the render was coming up black. And so that's something to look out for. Another thing to look out for is if you have some objects that are maybe hidden over in your scene, they might be blocking the lights and you may not know it. So one of the things you can do as well is go to this little filter at the top and say, turn on this little camera icon. That is the disable and renders option. And what that'll do is add a camera to all these objects. So you could say, hey, you know what, whenever I render, if I have some other thing in my scene, like maybe, I don't know, maybe there was a giant sphere around it, or you had some other object that, you know, was sitting there for whatever reason, I don't know. You could set it by turning this little camera icon off. It'll guarantee that when you do your bake, that object will have no effect on the render. So just hiding it isn't enough. You also need to make sure it's not happening in the render. Okay, so I'm back here. The last thing I'm going to do is put it back to my nice looking render where things were sharp, and I can get rid of all the stuff I don't need. Now my material is super simple. It's just the baked lighting, not this one, that's the low res one. My baked lighting texture is piped into the base color, and it's going to the material output. Now, that would work just perfectly in hubs. I could load it in and it would look fine, but it's still a little bit expensive because I have a shader that's using all of these options, like metallic and roughness and things that I don't really care about. But those shaders are actually a little bit more expensive in a game engine. And the same goes for using it in hubs. So instead of using a principled BSDF shader, Hubs also supports what's called an unlit shader. and that's supported by the GLTF format as well. So what we can do instead of using this is use a node called background. Background is the way you get a fully what's called unlit shader. I don't like the word unlit because that implies there's no lighting. You might think of it as fully lit or like fully illuminated. So instead of using this principled BSDF, what I'll do is I'll look in my add menu and I'm looking for one called background. Now you'll notice it doesn't exist in here. And that's kind of a flaw in my opinion of this version of Blender. A better way to get it is you can find it under the world section. And the world section is where we put in our image-based lighting background that we used before. There's the background node there. You can simply copy it and paste it over into the other object view. But you'll notice that it is in here now. It's under shader background. What I do is I go to add shader and then I right click on background and choose add to quick favorites. I already have it added, so it says remove from quick favorites. But what that means is that wherever I am, whether I'm in world or I'm in object mode, now I can just simply hit Q, which is the shortcut for quick favorites, and find it. Where did I put it? There it is, background. And this is about as simple a shader as you can get. Way simpler than principled BSDF. So instead, I'm just going to pipe it into there and pipe background into the material output surface. Blinked for a second, and now it's using that shader instead. So I can totally eliminate that, just use a background shader, and this is going to come out exactly the way it looks here. This works really, really well. Now I can have the object selected. I choose File, Export to GLTF, and I'm going to call this Atlas Object Lighting. I'm going to make sure that I have only selected objects, and everything else I'll just leave at the defaults. I don't need any kind of fancy settings. We'll hit Export GLTF 2.0. It's going to be a GLB, that's the default. That's what Hubs likes, and should take only a second or two at the most. Okay, so now I'm back over in my Firefox browser, and I'm in a Hubs room where I started originally, and all I need to do to bring my object in here to test is to open up a file browser and look for my object. There it is. It's called Atlas Object Lighting. It's a GLB file, and it's only about 4 megs. We could probably get it smaller if we use some better compression on the texture, but let's try it out. I'm going to drag and drop it right into the Hubs window here. Wait a second, and there it is. Now check it out. It has, if I move around it, all of the lighting information that I had in Blender. So it's doing the exact same thing like this room is doing, where all the texture contains the lighting information. So that's it. That's how you get your baked lighting onto your objects in Hubs. Now just to show you, if you're actually trying to create a scene like the one I was in, you would probably want to be using Spoke. And in this case, I can do the same exact thing I did before, where I get my object, I drag and drop it down into my assets here. And now this object is easy to bring in. You can just right click it and say place object at origin. And there it is. It's the exact size that it was. Blender. May not have realized it was that big, but it's a couple meters across. And this has all the lighting information that I need. Within Spoke, I don't actually need a light at all if I want to get rid of it. And I definitely don't need one casting any shadows or anything, because this object is actually ignoring the light completely because it's using an unlit shader done with that background node in Blender. So I can turn off shadows for it. Maybe I just want to keep this light around so that avatars and other dynamic objects still have some lighting on them. But I'm safe to go ahead and just create a scene out of a baked lit object and then publish to Hubs. So that's it.